So a lot of you guys have been wondering about our thoughts on Nvidia's DLSS 5 technology. Obviously quite a controversial technology that debuted earlier in the week. And well, we're here to sort of give you a little snippet of our views on this particular technology. What you're going to see is a clip from the Hardware Unboxed podcast where Steve and I extensively discussed DLSS 5 and our initial impressions. And we just thought, well, since a lot of you guys have been asking, it might be worth putting a preview or a clip of that on the main channel as well. So it may not be the full discussion that we have. So once the discussion that is on the main channel is over, you can go and listen to the rest of it in the Hardware Unboxed podcast episode. But for now, since this is a really hot topic and people will be interested, these are our thoughts on DLSS 5. But before we get into it,
today's video is brought to you by Insta360 and their Link to 4K webcam, now available in white. Building on the original Link, the Link 2 includes AI tracking for individuals and groups, auto framing, and auto gesture controls. For a webcam, it has fantastic autofocus with no focus pulsing, which is a major plus. It also now offers modes such as customizable backgrounds, adding versatility to every use case. The Link 2 is equipped with a gimbal, making it perfect for presentations, meetings, group calls, and any situation where you might be moving around. The 4K 30fps sensor offers excellent performance even in low light situations, and you can really only get better performance out of something like a digital SLR camera. With various AI features and a user-friendly desktop app, achieving the perfect presentation's a breeze. It also pairs perfectly with the new Wave speakerphone. For more information on how you can score a discount plus an Insight Pro membership, please click the link in the video description.
Obviously, most people watching this podcast have seen Nvidia's DLSS 5 announcement. There's been some heated reactions to this, some quite divisive reactions as well. Obviously, we do not have hands-on with this technology. It's not released. It's coming later this year, supposedly. So this is just based on Nvidia's, I guess, demonstration that they showed at their press event earlier this week. So I guess I'll just start with my initial impressions of DLSS 5 based on what Nvidia has shown. I think, like with a lot of AI-based technology, it's technically interesting. So the way that they're implementing this technology, the way that it works, at least from that standpoint, seems interesting to me, that they're taking graphics technology in this direction. It's something that we haven't really seen before. So all of that side of things is interesting because I'm always interested in new technology for games and that sort of thing, whether it's good, bad, or whatever. My reactions to the image quality that Nvidia sort of showed in their presentation, I thought it generally looked bad across most of the images that I saw. I'm not quite sure why Nvidia showed these specific images to show off the technology. I think that kind of backfired on them, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that later. But I think generally the output that they showed made things, I wouldn't say look worse necessarily, but look different in a way that I wasn't a fan of. So things like the changes to the face of Grace in Resident Evil, I thought it made her look like a different person in a way that, you know, sort of had the vibes of AI slop or Instagram filters, sort of Facebook memes that people have sometimes shared that are AI generated. It had that kind of look, which is not, I'm not a huge fan of that type of look, the AI look. I felt that that image from Resident Evil and some of the other examples as well sort of had that I guess, visual style to it. And then the changes to the environment, I thought this was probably a bit more acceptable outside of the faces, but I still felt like what they showed in games like, I think it was Oblivion Remastered, Assassin's Creed Shadows, it reminded me of those sort of YouTube videos showing off like hyper real edits of games or like reshade mods where they crank the contrast and lighting up to maximum, as opposed to more sort of what I would say is a realistic, like how I think the developers would have gone for realism in those games. And it did kind of make some of the games look a bit samey in the way that it handles some of the reflections and things. Like it made Assassin's Creed Shadows look really bright, for example. It kind of made the same look from Oblivion as well. And those two games have quite different styles when you're playing them. So it kind of gave this sort of samey feel. So that's just based on, you know, the sorts of visuals that I saw. I wasn't like when I see things like DLSS 4 technology or whatever, I'm like, okay, you know, I'm pretty on board with this. This looks reasonable. With DLSS 5, I sort of got more, you know, like AI slop vibes. And then there's obviously the whole technical angle that we'll get into, the needing it to run on 2 RTX 5090s. What does this mean for performance and VRAM in games in the future? But yeah, my impressions, I think, were largely negative, I would say, based on what they showed. What did you think of what they had shown off?
Well, I think, like you said, I think it's, what was the word? It's like interesting, technically impressive, I thought. I don't know. My initial impressions of what they were showing were probably different to most people's, I don't know, reaction or just their takeaway from it. I wasn't as outraged or as upset about it as most people. And maybe that's surprising given that initially not a fan of ray tracing. Still think to this day, ray tracing has been heavily underwhelming based on what we were sold, especially with, obviously the 20 series. DLSS upscaling, initial iteration of that was terrible, really bad. They sort of had to go back to the drawing board, rethink it, come back with DLSS 2.0, which was much better. So, we were critical of that initially, but that's gotten better over time. Stuff like frame generation, obviously I've been much more critical of that than you have. Not really a fan of that technology. But at the same time, I'm not outraged or upset by it. And I think that's kind of the same thing with DLSS 5. I don't like how a lot of these features get weaponized, and maybe that's a concern for something like a DLSS 5, for example, yet to be seen, but that's always a concern with Nvidia because they absolutely did that with frame generation, and I think that's the biggest sticking point for you and I with frame generation, right? Neither of us are, where it's kind of like a feature where we're happy enough for it to exist. You can use it if you want to use it. If you like it, that's fantastic. If you don't like it, you don't have to use it. That's kind of frame generation in a nutshell, except then it's used to be weaponized by the marketing team and CEOs to say ridiculous things like, 5070 equals 4090 when that couldn't be further from the truth. So keeping all that in mind, you probably, because some people think I've been really, I hate ray tracing. I've crapped on DLSS. I think frame generation's garbage. So I'm just going to hate DLSS 5. But I was watching it and I was just genuinely intrigued and interested and thought, okay, there's endless possibilities here. Yeah, some of the examples weren't great and I certainly didn't like, but there were other ones that I genuinely just thought it looked a lot better. Like, what were your thoughts on Starfield, for example? Maybe I'm an idiot, but I was sitting there thinking these characters definitely look better. Like, this is a huge upgrade to the game. If this was released as some sort of like texture pack, like remastered version of Starfield, I think people would be raving about it. If you remove the AI from it and how they've actually achieved it, I think if that was a remastered version of Starfield, people would be just blown away. It addresses one of the bigger problems with that game. But what are your thoughts on that, for example?
Yeah, I think the Starfield example is probably one of the better examples in terms of the face rendering side of things. Mm-hmm. I feel that's largely because Starfield looks pretty bad. Like, when it came out, I wasn't a fan of how it looked visually. Not just the faces, which are obviously bad in my opinion, but the whole game. I feel like that the style, everything in that game didn't really work for me. So to have a system that can sort of take the faces that, in my opinion, looked bad in that game and change them in the way that DLSS 5 has changed them, that is certainly impressive. That it didn't require additional, developers to go in, change the geometry of the faces, relight them, improve the textures. It just uses AI to do that. But at the same time, it's sort of like it changed it, but it made it's just not quite as good as I would have hoped if the system was working correctly. Like, to have a system that can do that, but make it look really photoreal and excellent, I would have gone, wow, that's like incredible. But to me, it felt like they had essentially just slapped AI-generated faces onto the top of the Starfield models. And I guess you could argue that that is an improvement because the models originally were bad. Mm-hmm. I wasn't like wowed, I guess, by it. I was like, I can see what they're doing here and it looks okay, I guess. Is it a pure improvement? It depends whether the final version, to me, whether it has that AI look or whether it doesn't have that AI look. If they can make it not look as AI as it looked in the demo, I think that would be a really significant achievement. If it still has that sort of feeling of like, they've just superimposed faces on top of the models, maybe not so much. And I feel like the still images are perhaps an even better example than the video samples that they sort of showed in motion, where you sort of get that AI face on top of the models, but then the animation of the models is still the Starfield animation. So that almost, to me, created this kind of uncanny valley where they'd used, the detail in the model or whatever is maybe subjectively better, but it doesn't mesh well with the animation the game has. So it sort of had that disjointed feel to me.
That's fair.
But yeah, I can certainly understand why you would look at that game and sort of say, yeah, that is a better looking face because the faces were bad in that game to begin with. But then if I contrast that with, I've already mentioned Grace from Resident Evil, which I think generally looked worse and just like a different person, or some of the Hogwarts Legacy examples.
I think they were some of the better examples of it not being great, just because that game has a specific art style and it's not meant to be photorealistic. So it didn't really make sense to use that specific game, whereas I think, Starfield's probably a better example. Yeah,
Resident Evil, it felt like they just cranked up the filter to like 11 and it just ended up changing the model. I mean, people have sort of done, they've superimposed the DLSS 5 image directly over the non-DLSS 5 image to sort of show, hey, it is the same underlying model, but there's new lighting here or whatever to change how it looks. Whatever the technical realities of how it works are, I still think the face in that example looked different to me, like a different person. So from that sense, that's why I thought it looked bad. And then the Hogwarts Legacy example, I think they changed, the main character in that game is a child, and it sort of made it kind of look like a middle-aged man, which I thought was, again, like maybe just applying the filter indiscriminately, like they're not really thinking about what was that character in the game and how do we use this to enhance the lighting for that character. They're just like, hit the Gen AI button, out comes the result, and it just turns out that it made the character middle-aged, which is certainly not the case playing that game. So I think the faces is, that needs work. Like if we're going to be like ignoring the whole is generative AI bad or not sort of angle, from a do I like this visual output angle, it needs a lot more work than what they showed in the faces to make them more realistic, less uncanny valley, and not to have that AI look, which I guess I didn't like.
Yeah, and I guess that's fair. And maybe Nvidia would be sitting here scratching their head going, well, yeah, it's an early demo. So like it's not a final product. It's room for improvement. You can tune things. This was just an early presentation because we're excited about the technology and we thought you guys would be as well. And again, I'm not defending Nvidia here or anything. I just feel like all of those things are fair. Like the Assassin's Creed Shadows example, I actually agree. I think the game looked much worse with DLSS 5 in pretty much all of the examples shown. Way too bright. It was like one of those cheap fake HDR type filter things. Didn't like that. There were some scenes in Oblivion that gave me the same vibes, but then there were some other scenes that did look really good, I thought. So I was mixed on that one. And then even the world in Starfield, I thought looked a bit odd at times. It was a bit, too filtered and looked too different. But I did like, from what I saw, I preferred the characters there. But I guess I was also watching it thinking, okay, how much better is this going to get? And if this is, whenever I look at this stuff, there's a heap of things going on in my head. First of all, I'm like, okay, so this is an Nvidia showcase, probably a best case scenario of what they have now. So keep that in mind. But also it is an early preview. And if we think back to things like DLSS that were just an abomination when they were released, and then people may still argue that now, I think that's probably a bit unfair. You and I are quite impressed with what they've been able to achieve with DLSS. So that's certainly improved. And, they could probably do the same with this. I don't know. I guess if you ask for my thoughts, looking at it back now, I'm kind of numb to it all. Like I wasn't too strongly opinionated in one direction or the other. I was like, this is pretty neat. This is impressive. I don't know if I'm excited about the direction we're going in. Like to date, I haven't been super wrapped with how we've gone since like the GeForce 20 series. I don't know. I'm not extremely upset about this.
Yeah, I'm not yet convinced that what they've shown with DLSS 5 and the issues that I have with it can be solved with current generative AI technology, because I feel like a lot of other generative AI tools also create this AI look.
Mhm.
And so NVIDIA's got a big challenge here to sort of prove that they can make this technology not look like that. And
Mhm.
certainly they haven't shown any examples so far that I would say don't have that look. And I think if they had showed some sort of AI enhancing technology for games that didn't have the AI look but worked in a largely similar way, I think the reaction would be very, very different, because it appears to me that, we did a poll, for example. I think 80% of people said that they thought it made games look worse. That was a sample size of about 25,000 plus people. And so if it didn't have that AI look, I think those sorts of polls would be very different, and the whole opinion of it would be more related to things like maybe the concerns around generative AI and how it's trained, for example, as opposed to just the output. But I think the output as it stands right now, I wasn't excited about it.
My concerns would be more things like consistency, because that's a huge problem with generative AI, massive problem. Like, I will be surprised if characters look the same or, very, very similar throughout the game using this technology based on how we've seen it working. So yeah, consistency would be one of the bigger concerns I've got. But then, I mean, there's so much that's yet to be seen. Like, we're getting way ahead of ourselves on this one. Like, who is this technology for? Who's going to be able to use it? Like, what are the hardware requirements? What's the chances this is going to work in any capacity on an 8GB graphics card?
Oh, none. Absolutely none. So,
how much VRAM does it need? Is it going to work on a 12GB card? Like, is this something you'll be able to use in any capacity on a 5070?
The fact that they had to run this on an entirely separate 5090, I think, does throw into question the ability to run the model and the game at the same time, especially if VRAM is more of an issue. Because let's say, for example, that it used even just 16 gigabytes of VRAM or something to run the model, you're pretty much going to need a 5090 to run that in any game, just because some games can use easily these days 12 to 16 gigs. So if you need another 16 gig for the AI model DLSS 5 thing, I mean, that eliminates the vast majority of NVIDIA's GPUs.
Even if it requires 4 gigabytes of VRAM,
that's right.
That's going to be a struggle on 12 gigabyte cards for sure. Basically not possible, because that turns them into 8 gigabyte cards. And yeah, 16 would be, again, the bare minimum, which is what we've been saying all along. So I know that's an interesting aspect of it as well.
Yeah, that's right. So I mean, NVIDIA says that they want this to run on a single GPU later this year when they release it for people in the fall or /spring for us in Australia. I mean, yeah, that's a challenge. I'm not 100% sure how they'll do that. And then on top of that, is what they're showing today going to be downgraded to actually work on a single GPU? That's another concern, because they have the entire power of a second RTX 5090 to run what they're currently showing. And again, in my opinion, it currently doesn't produce images that I think are overly impressive in a lot of scenarios. So is it going to be, like, I'm saying the model has to get better to impress me.
And use less than half of the compute power.
That's right. They're going to have to simplify the model to get it to run on a single GPU, at least a single GPU that is available today. And maybe they're sort of thinking this more as a technology for future generations. I'm sure that's what they're thinking. But I mean, pretty ambitious to try and, optimize this sort of model.
Yeah, it'd have to be wildly inefficient at this point of the development. And how they're going to get it from that to something they can ship where it'll work on mid-range graphics cards this year. I mean, if they can do it, that's incredible. We'll have to see on that one. But they're more of the things I'm concerned about is actually, how relevant is this technology to begin with? Like, who's going to actually be able to use it? And then how usable is it going to be with stuff like consistency and that, like forgetting about just the image quality and stuff like that to begin with, like with what we've seen, just how good a job does it do of maintaining that throughout the game?
The demos did seem to be pretty controlled. There were certainly movements that I would have liked to do if I had control of it that I didn't see being done. So for example, fast camera movements, panning around and sort of moving away and then moving the scene back to the same scene to see whether it looks the same. the characters were sort of shown, here's a character, let's turn it on and off and have a look. But if you sort of got that character in a different lighting environment, is that character going to look the same? There's no real examples of that. And then there was pretty significant like temporal issues that I saw just in the slow motion sort of scenes that they had. Like, I think there was one Starfield example I saw where a character sort of moved in front of the screen and you got what I would describe as ghosting, like massive amounts of ghosting as the reflections were sort of being generated again over time and that sort of thing. And so that is going to be a big backward step if that is the image quality that is given to people in the final version, because NVIDIA's worked so hard over the years improving the temporal stability of games through things like DLSS 4 versus 3 and then 4.5 versus 4, to then go backwards in terms of ghosting stability with this AI version would be really, really disappointing, because I think those artifacts are things that people are becoming less tolerant of over time. The sort of TAA blurs being talked about a lot over the years, sizzling, things like that with FSR. If we're getting AI generated lighting, but then it's really unstable. And another issue with it is, as well, is that it seems largely screen space. So it's only really looking at the lighting elements that are physically on screen. So potentially if you look at different angles and the AI model is seeing different light sources, it's going to generate different lighting, which will mean that the lighting quality is going to be very inconsistent as you move around. Those are all very, very significant challenges. And I personally would not be interested in playing a game where, you walk around and the image is just like generating random stuff all the time. The noise, temporal issues are significant. And then, lighting sources don't really make sense. I find it interesting that a lot of the graphical advancements up to this point have been more simulation type of things, like path tracing, ray tracing. They're trying to make GPUs more powerful so that we can simulate realistic lighting. Like, we'll do the physics calculations. We'll make sure the bounces are all accurate. And we're trying to get this natural simulated look. And now NVIDIA is talking about this next generation feature being more of like an elaborate guessing system. Like, instead of simulating the lighting, they're now saying, well, we'll take the image and we'll sort of guess what the lights should be doing. We'll sort of guess that this should look like this. And I think that's what you sort of saw with some of those Assassin's Creed examples in the environments, where it's no longer simulating what it should have looked like. It's just going, oh, okay, well, we're guessing that should look like that, and that scene should look more shiny. So that's a good guess. Let's implement that. I don't know if I want that to be part of games. Like, I'm more interested in, I guess, simulating things over time instead of guessing them. You can see why I sort of sitting here saying, like, I'm not super excited about this until they sort of show that those are not going to be problems with the final version. Yeah, so I think the last thing I want to talk about with DLSS 5 is just the general reaction and how NVIDIA handled this launch, because I think largely they've handled it quite poorly. Obviously, the initial reactions were overwhelmingly negative. I was actually really surprised reading some of the threads on r/NVIDIA shortly after it was launched. Generally, they're more positive towards DLSS technologies on that particular Reddit. But even there, they were highly critical, I would say, of what NVIDIA has shown. So I find it a little bizarre that NVIDIA showed it in the way that they did, or at least didn't understand that the images and comparisons that they were showing would go down so badly with gamers. I guess maybe they didn't realize that the examples had this AI slop look to it. I'm not 100% sure. But I would be highly surprised if they expected the reaction that they got. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, logically, it makes sense that they expected it to go over much better than it did, because, they wouldn't have done it in the way they did. So I think they should go without saying, unless they're suckers for punishment.
Yes, well, I think some of the damage control that they were doing afterwards probably suggests that they weren't expecting the reaction. And I'm pointing to things like they quite quickly started stressing about the creative control angle for developers. That feels a little damage control-y to me. And then, Jensen coming out and saying that gamers were wrong to claim that the output looks bad. I mean, that's a pretty tone-deaf response, in my opinion. I don't think you can really come out and sort of say, well, the gamers are wrong. The gamers had an opinion about this, that it looked bad, but they're wrong to have that opinion. Because ultimately, same with the DF stuff, it's an opinion. Like, you can't just be like, well, your opinion is wrong, because it's ultimately a subjective opinion about the visual look of the game. So yeah, Jensen saying that I thought was pretty tone deaf. Did you have any thoughts about his comments?
Not particularly. They didn't shock me or anything like that. I think it's on the consumer front, it's becoming increasingly difficult for Nvidia for a whole number of reasons. Not just because their marketing has been, like I said, so weaponized on so many different fronts over the years, and people are waking up to the fact that a good amount of what they say is, how do I put it? Let's say BS. Again, the famous 50-70 equals 40-90, and there's been endless other examples. So I think people are getting pretty sick of being lied to their faces, and being treated like they're idiots. And then there's the whole, AI thing on top of that as well, which is just a big old amount of salt in the wound on that one. So, yeah, I know we've seen Jensen cry, for a lack of a better term, about people hating on AI multiple times over the past few months. So this is just sort of a continuation of that. But I think they're in a position where they're just like, well, we're doing it anyway, and you'll like it. And you'll have no choice but to like it and whatever. So they're just going to push ahead with it. So we'll have to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, I think the generative AI angle is, in terms of people's, I guess, mixed to negative reactions about generative AI, is going to be quite interesting to see how that plays out in the gaming space, because there's a lot of developers out there and artists working on games who are very anti-generative AI. And so there's going to be, unlike a technology like DLSS upscaling, which uses an AI model but is not generative AI, it is a machine learning system trained to do a specific task. It's going to be interesting to see what the adoption of this technology is like when you have a lot of that anti-AI sentiment among the actual developers creating games, who often see games as art. I don't want to get into the discussion too much about are games art or whatever, but certainly some developers have a very negative opinion of generative AI. They don't want to use it in games. And gamers themselves have a negative opinion of the use of generative AI for things like assets in games, textures, art that is used in titles. And there have been significant backlashes to games that have been found to be using this technology. And so that's going to create this really interesting scenario where DLSS 5 being a generative AI technology may not be adopted in the way that we've seen from these other standpoints, based on the angle of generative AI is anti-art or whatever, or steals assets to train models, or whatever the case is.
Yeah, the moral implications are the big one there, right? That's what a lot of people are upset about.
Okay, so that's just our sort of initial early impressions of DLSS 5. We do get into quite a bit more stuff in the Hardware Unboxed podcast episodes. If you're interested in more talk about DLSS 5 and also Crimson Desert, if you're just interested in that game, then go check out our full discussion in that video as well. It's been really interesting to follow a lot of the reactions to this technology. I think you probably would have seen in our podcast and this clip that we sort of have a balanced view on this, I would sort of say. We're not overly negative about it. We do think there's some qualities to it as well. So it'd be interesting to see the feedback from you guys in the video comments and everything as well. But if you do want more of our thoughts over on the podcast, you can listen to. So yeah, just thought Steve and I do have slightly different opinions on this. So this sort of snippet preview for people on the main channel is probably the best way of doing things. Plus also, we've been testing things, we've been sick, so we haven't been able to get to it as quickly as we might have liked. So anyway, that's our thoughts on DLSS 5. Thanks to everyone who sort of watched this video, who will watch the podcast as well. But until then, I guess, yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.